indicate is sanctioned areas for free expression is necessary for youth engagement and for graffiti activists to show their
sanctioned
true
areas, youth engagement. How is like art classes and just being able to paint on a canvas not access creative expression?
So we'll answer that in two different ways. The first of which is the arts are being drastically cut in high school since there's a lack of funding for high school education. That's the first thing to go. The second argument is art classes have a direct curriculum. Sanctioned areas that allow for free expression, i.e. youth and other activists to show their true meaning of what they want to show.
How do internet forums like YouTube not provide for this outlet for creative and free expression?
So, well, first off, we'll say there's no bright line for how much creativity should exist. The next answer will be things like YouTube have censorship and things that aren't necessarily shown, plus you can be like flamed out of that by other people. We'll say that self-expression through art is more.
Sweet. Thank you.
I'm going to take 20 seconds of the break.
Okay.
Is anyone not ready? The affirmative's call to rights ignore the material impacts that this sort of gross irresponsibility causes in our communities. When Rio de Janeiro passed Law 706/07 through the decriminalization of graffiti, it resulted in a rapid proliferation of graffiti all across Rio de Janeiro. This is incredibly problematic because as our piece of evidence from the real-time sites, this graffiti was not just the legalized graffiti that the policymakers saw, but also a huge increase of different sorts of illegal graffiti that still existed. This is incredibly problematic in the context of a paper published by Dr. Coughlin, one of the experts on the legal ramifications of graffiti. Dr. Coughlin talks about the ways in which the public perceives of graffiti results in a decrease of property values. This is incredibly important for a very specific way. School districts, school zones, are essentially tax zones about the ways in which property taxes should be allocated to specific educational institutions. In the ways in which graffiti would result in a perceptive loss of property value results in a literal net decrease of tax revenue made available for these schools to be able to use. This is incredibly important in the context of the way the affirmative paints different sorts of educational programs they could foster. With that decrease in tax revenue, suddenly that money that would have been used for those programs dries up and is no longer available. This is also incredibly important because art is the first thing that is cut from every school budget. STEM will be preserved because it is a direct line for jobs, but art is something that is not seen as inherently valuable because of the way current policy perceptions of the value of art exist in the workplace. On to their case. Everything the affirmative wants to do already exists. Period. City building permits are needed to be able to commission private murals. This is something that exists in the status quo and something that Kilroy's on Kirkwood down there has already done. If you go walk down on 4th Street, you can see the giant mural of the Indy 500 or of the Little 500 that they have commissioned by requesting a city building permit from the city of Bloomington. Upon the approval of that and upon the city of Bloomington approving the message that is portrayed, they were able to produce this. The second thing they isolate is the ability for different sorts of murals to be allowed on public property. This is also false. Zoning regulations in the city of Indianapolis justified the painting of murals underneath two bridges as well as on the entirety of the Indianapolis Canal. Walking on the Indianapolis Canal, you were constantly assaulted on one side by beautiful murals, on the second by a river. Those and the changing of zoning regulations have allowed for those murals to exist. The affirmative does not allow for them. This is incredibly important because that means the only sorts of graffiti that they allow are tags, obscene graffiti, and different sorts of gang signs. These are not the types of graffiti that increase property values. These are not the types of graffiti that allow for sort of artistic expression or democratic engagement. These are specific types of graffiti that the public has seen as deviant and bad and reduce property values. If I am going to go buy a house, I don't want to go up to a house and buy something with some scrawls on the side or with an obscene image on the side, because that is not. The second thing they've isolated is this copyright. This is also a non-issue. Margaret Mettler, a person with a JD from the University of Michigan Law School, has identified multiple cases in which the First Amendment rights of the private property owner take precedent over the possible First Amendment rights of the person who commits graffiti. The private property owner will always have the ability to take and co-opt all graffiti placed on their property. This is an uncontested fact. That means that the copyright and the co-option arguments that they have identified are inevitable and just allow for the usage of the private property owner to be able to do it. Also, copyrights are incredibly expensive to the tune of $10,000, meaning they don't have the access for these marginalized populations to be able to afford them. There is also no bright line for what sort of creativity are good or what sort of creativity they create, meaning you can't measure the affirmative. Thank you.
Ready?
Yes.
So the private sphere can commission murals, we can all agree to that.
Sure.
Are the graffiti that is placed in areas or that are in public areas copyrighted? Like, can others steal from them and have any risk of legal ramifications?
In the way in which First Amendment judicial precedent is established, the private property owner upon the commission allows for the usage of that mural in the way in which to filing for a copyright. So yes, the person who owns the property can file a copyright claim for something that they have commissioned.
That sounds fancy, but what it's not answering my question is, if I paint a mural in a public area, can someone else see that mural and paint the exact same thing, charge for the mural, and have any risk of being sued over copyright or intellectual property theft?
In the status quo, the person who owns the building, i.e. in this case in the public sphere, the government, would have First Amendment access to the property, even in the context of First Amendment access of the painter themselves.
I don't think that answered my question.
Yes, it does. Your question was whether or not people could utilize that for copyright. I said the people who get to utilize it for copyright are the government institutions or the buildings upon which
So the government could sue, which we agree. Does the individualized painter or artist have any chance of stopping intellectual property theft in the status quo?
I am answering the next question. The next question is whether if they do have the ability to fight back, they will always lose because of the court cases that Margaret Mettler has identified
That's
in her
not
paper.
answered. That's fine. So I guess my question is, property value goes down from certain things like tagging and obscene graffiti.
Yep.
Where does your evidence ever cite that things like murals decrease property value? Or commission
The sorts of murals that you've identified that could be productive are things that can already exist in the status quo, your zoning laws and permit regulations.
Let's talk about that. Zoning laws and permit regulations do not allow for sanctioned off areas that graffiti is
That is
legal and
empirically
allowed on
false.
buildings
That
in
is
certain
empirically
areas.
false. In LA, San Francisco, and New York City,
They have
they
commissioned.
allowed for zoning regulations of underneath bridges for places in which communities could engage in graffiti.
So they have commissioned artwork by certain
No,
artists.
they
There are no
set
public
off places in
or
which the
zones.
zoning has been reduced to allow for the public usage of graffiti. That exists in the status quo. Okay.
It just needs to have that red light right there. You can zoom in and out.
Everybody's set? Order. With darkness. There are three primary reasons why graffiti regulations should be reduced. The first of which is free speech and self-expression. It's at the core of our democracy. It's the reason why it's our very first amendment, our first right, is the one to free expression and free speech. And graffiti is central to that. Furthermore, they have not addressed the argument that self-expression is essential through an alternate form of art. Not all people feel welcome in certain art galleries, and they are excluded from those types of art communities. So this provides an alternate type of self-expression. Furthermore, copyright laws allow for artistic protection. However, currently, it can be co-opted and exploited as a resource through which private companies can take those artistic renderings and take advantage of them for capital gains without the approval of the artist. Finally, and one of our most important points, which they have not contested, is youth engagement. It allows for sanctioned areas where you can do graffiti without any negative penalties on a far larger scale than currently exists now that they try to assert would replicate the type of culture that we're trying to produce. This is not just art class in which students feel compelled to go, but rather an active way for these students to engage and develop a creative form of self-expression for them. Now, Rio is an example they provided, which is not analogous. First of all, there's already a lot of illegal graffiti activity that exists, which means that there's no evidence that indicates a direct correlation between allowing graffiti to occur and further increases in graffiti. Furthermore, we would still prohibit things like gang-related graffiti, offensive graffiti, etc., which wouldn't allow for that sort of increase in illegal activity. Now, it does decrease property value. It does increase property value and the amount of money that we could have. We've read evidence that says that it costs them a huge financial burden to clean up all of this property, to police it, to monitor who's putting things up where. We would be able to save all of that money and revenue, and instead of having to invest there, we could reinvest it in other places, like in education or in local communities, which would offset any potential costs to decrease in property value, if it did in fact decrease. But it wouldn't. Our evidence says that it would actually increase property values because it would contribute to an overall beautification and artistry within the city itself, instead of having it continue to be run down or unartistic. Now, they've asserted throughout the end of their speech that we don't change anything. This is wrong. First, public buildings, and they're not public places where you can freely do the types of graffiti that we would allow, unique areas where it's entirely allowed for you to graffiti anywhere you want. There are small areas where specific artists can be commissioned to do graffiti, like Indiana, like IU could ask someone to do graffiti on a particular wall of a private building, someone who's a resident within Bloomington. But this couldn't occur on a large scale or more broadly. Finally, they said that private property can already pay for this in a transactional fee, but that does not address the core issue of free speech and self-expression, because it's not free speech if it's included within a transactional cost, i.e. you're being paid or patroned for your service, which means that the adjustments in regulation are essential both for free self-expression and for youthful engagement in artistic activity.
Do you mind if I use your timer to keep an eye on the process?
What time of light?
Thanks. So less than Zach. So you have identified that the affirmative does not allow for either offensive or gang-related graffiti. Who gets the offensive to whom?
Well, there's certainly a set of criteria we could come to, for example, swear words, derogatory terms that are historical.
What about a term like All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter painted on a courthouse?
What about it?
Is that considered offensive, post-affirmative? Is that a sort of graffiti that would be removed?
Well, if it was, our argument is not that people could put anything up wherever they wanted. So you'd have to have a process through which you could determine if you could graffiti in a particular area.
Who's paying for
But
that process?
What?
Who's paying for that process?
What process?
So like the process of deciding whether or not something is good or not, we're gonna have to hire
It would
some
be
masters
much-
of PhD people would be able to provide.
Masters of it would be far, far cheaper than the current process of retroactively paying to paint over all of the graffiti, to have police
That's fine.
try to track down who did the original graffiti, all of which happens every time you have to open an investigation.
Sure.
Furthermore, All Lives Matter is an example of political speech, just like saying Black Lives Matter is. You can disagree with the tenets of it, but it's a fundamental right of our democracy that you can express that if that's your opinion.
Okay. One more question. What incentive do people have to go play in this little sectioned off graffiti zone you've made for them when their message could be much more heard if they put it in a more public space, like on the court steps or in the public park?
Well, first of all, this is one element of what we would allow to occur. And just like people like to play in parks now, it's really fun, it's a great way to express yourself. So I think that that's a value that we could have. Our evidence said that it would allow for increased youthful engagement in artistic projects because it gets them excited about being involved as opposed to being forced to sit in art class, things like that, which is
What
definitely a
does the
benefit.
affirmative do to stop kids from being forced to sit in art class? You've identified
No,
that
nothing.
you
It's
increase
just
art programs for them.
No, nothing. It's just an alternative way of motivating people to get involved in artistry. It's an example.
Thanks again, Zach.
You're so welcome.
Alright, so are we all ready to go? Fantastic. So first on the property value argument. Now they've only provided one real response to the property value argument, i.e. saying that they create this beautification or that they create these murals which actually increase property values. Now this is simply not the case because what they're describing is the status quo. In the status quo, you can already commission murals to be on the side of buildings. You can already commission art to be put on your side of building. They have not provided a distinction between the words mural, art, and graffiti. None of these things have been defined by the affirmative, so don't give them that leeway and ground of saying, oh, that's a mural and that's not graffiti. Who is determining this subjective interpretation of art? Now, that further proves our point that this is already permitted in the status quo, meaning that the affirmative has fallen into one of two things. One, They do not do anything distinct from the status quo, meaning that you should vote negative on presumption because they have not changed the status quo at all. Or they do change the status quo, and the only way that they can change the status quo is by permitting less sightly forms of graffiti, things that people would not determine as art or beautification, indicating that they would actually decrease property values. Now, decreasing in property values has a tangible impact, and that is cutting the education funding. Now, property values and taxation is directly one of the largest sources of funding for public schools and education in those formats. And as was uncontested, the claim that my partner Nick made is that one of the first programs cut when school budgets are tightened is art programs, meaning that their argument of how youth engagement, about how they create creative ideas and art engagement, no, those would actually be stripped from the school spending and stripped from school funding because they would cut the art programs due to the lack of income from the decreased property values due to decreased property values. Now, furthermore, even if they somehow win that they don't allow unsightly graffiti in the status quo, one, that takes out their freedom of speech argument because you're only allowing sightly or good opinions or good art or good graffiti to be painted, meaning that there's no freedom to expression. There's only the freedom to express good speech, which turns the whole argument because they're saying, oh, we only allow the good speech that we like, not the speech we disagree with. Furthermore, their argument, furthermore, they don't have a tangible impact to that. Right, so now I'm going to move on to their three arguments here. First argument is this freedom of speech thing. I've already answered that, as well as a transaction is not a freedom of speech. The bottom of Harry's speech was talking about that, how through a commissioned piece of art is not freedom of speech. The way that they define how the affirmative functions in the first affirmative speech is that private property owners have to consent and agree to graffiti being painted on their private property. That is a transaction, even if it's $0. The consent of the private property owner being required for that art to be painted on their wall is a transaction and still requires previous approval. It is not the freedom of expression of the graffiti artist, but rather just what the private property owner decides to have on their wall. There's no distinction made there, and there's no tangible impact to this. Secondly, their argument here is copyright. However, first, they haven't answered the argument that copyright costs tens of thousands of dollars, which isn't easily accessible to a lot of the people painting graffiti in the first place. And secondly, due to pre-existing laws, as to what was the court case name?
Schultz versus...
In Schultz versus Lieberman, that proves that there's underlying law that the affirmative does not change, which is that when art is painted on a wall, it is not the artist who owns that art, but rather the private property or public property owner, meaning that they don't give any copyright to the graffiti artist. They do not change at all. The third argument that they made about youth engagement, that we've already turned to this argument by proving that art programs get cut from this. Now, the last distinction made here is the Rio distinction here. Now, our Rio evidence is fantastic on this question. It says, here's a direct line from it. That's not to say most of the street art or graffiti seen around Rio is legal. Most of it is not. Proving that even if they are increasing legal graffiti, due to that, illegal graffiti also increases, which would be obscene graffiti, offensive graffiti, illegal graffiti, all these hate speech, etc. I am open for cross-ex.
Okay, so let's talk about the process of commissioning graffiti
Sure.
for public or private spaces.
Yep.
If a government official or a private owner of a piece of real estate had commissioned graffiti for their property,
Yep.
would they not have already taken into account any negative property value damage that would result from that piece of artwork?
This exists in the status quo. You can commission art to be painted on your walls in the status quo.
Right, so the affirmative neither hurts nor increases property values.
The affirmative doesn't change the status quo in that case.
Yeah,
That was our double bind argument.
No,
One, either you don't change the status quo.
This isn't an answer because we have a whole part of the act that's about creating sanctioned spaces for
Which
graffiti to
also
occur.
exists in the status quo.
Not only does it not exist, but that's not the question. The question at hand
Okay.
is if people are determining what graffiti goes up where, they've already calculated for the effect that it will have
You're
on their
assuming
property.
perfect judgment in people. People don't have perfect judgment. People can't determine what the market's going to say about that exactly. They're not going to be like, ah, yes, this subsect of the population loves this art and they'll come to my store because of that.
Property value is definitely determined by what people think of the value of the property.
Right, and you're claiming that people are going to have perfect interpretations of how
So
people
then what
value
would
that.
decrease property value? Like
What would decrease property
What
values?
about graffiti decreases
We
property
have proven statistics which indicate that
Go
graffiti
through them.
decreases property. Go through the
What-
statistics? Sure.
Explain the logic behind the statistics.
Sure, the logic behind this statement is pretty simple. There are large subsects of consumers that do not appreciate graffiti or do not like that style of art. Ergo, they are not going to live there. Which consumers? Like,
Yeah.
What, do you want me to like name them individually?
Style of artwork that has many ranges and forms.
Okay, this is further
That's like
proving our
saying
point that the
people don't
F
like
is
paint.
non-definable.
People say
Some
that
people don't like paint. Like, let's be real here. There are many subjective
it
interpretations
seems like you have
which are
no
proving our point.
you have no standard for evaluating how property use would be affected, which is the
Yeah, we
only
do.
point you
Move
have.
forward. We have evidence.
Main reasons for voting after today's debate. The first one is the freedom of speech proves that open spaces are necessary for the self-expression of marginalized communities who want to show what they truly believe. Now, this has not been properly answered because of the first reason is there's no transaction in a free space. No one is commissioning artists to go to certain areas that are allowed to show what they truly believe on the inside without any risk of judgment or a larger force stopping them. And next is they've never answered the fact that people feel otherized and marginalized by bougie places like museums or art galleries where they cannot truly show their self-expression. Only this mass increase of sanctioned off spaces can allow people to truly express what they're feeling in forms of artistic value, not under the proprietor of someone trying to sell their art for a profitable gain. Now, the second reason is youth engagement is at the core of American values. The youth cannot properly engage or self-express in the status quo because there are no spaces to do so. They cite 2 bridges. This is not sufficient. The affirmative team opens up large spaces of city planning for the sole reason of self-expression through terms of graffiti. That is a net difference in the status quo. Now, they say that the copyright doesn't make sense because of a pre-written law, but what the affirmative team does is it gives the artist's rights away from the building and towards the artist. So the artist has full control of their values, which stops things like intellectual theft and encourages an increase of art, even if art values are going down. Now, they only go for the property value argument, but what they have conceded is the status quo is the same as the act in the instance of property rights are given to the property owner, which means they have to be commissioned in things like neighborhoods, i.e. there's not a net increase of graffiti on neighborhood homes, which means there's no net decrease of property value. It only allows for things like murals, which, as we all have conceded, increases property rights for things like the canal in Indianapolis. Now, lastly, they say in the Rio de Janeiro argument, they have conceded that Rio is different legally and legislatively because their police force functions differently than the one in America. And there was also graffiti beforehand that is seen as obscene. So for that.
Okay. So when signing your ballot negative in this debate, the question that you should be asking yourself is there a distinction between the affirmative and the status quo that has been articulated consistently throughout the affirmative speeches? There has not been one, because the only things that they describe are, one, these public spaces where anyone can graffiti. Those exist in the status quo. They have not provided a reason why somehow making more of them acts as any form of solvency. No, it's not just those 2 bridges as I try and paint it as. Those are simple concrete examples of these places which already exist. Secondly, the only other argument that the affirmative makes is that they're allowing these permitting of murals and permitting of graffiti on private property. That also exists in the status quo. You can access a building zone permit to get art painted on your wall in the first place. Now, the offensive reason why you vote negative in the absence of that, in the absence of them being distinct from the status quo, is the fact that property values would decrease. Now, the reason why property values would decrease is because the only distinction that the affirmative can have from the status quo is the painting of non-beautified murals and non-beautified graffiti, because that's already allowed in the status quo. Meaning that the only distinction can be these things which are not termed as beautification, but are actually things that decrease property value. Now, that has a tangible impact on education budgets, school budgets, and specifically art budgets, which turns their youth engagement arguments into killing the budgets for art classes. Now, their arguments. One, their free speech argument. They've obviously conceded that they're requiring people to get permits to paint on walls, or requiring the permission of the private property owners to paint on the wall eliminates that freedom of speech. So the only space they're talking about the freedom of speech are these zones where they allow graffiti to occur. Now, obviously, in these zones where graffiti allows to occur exist in the status quo. We provided numerous examples of them. Means that this freedom of speech exists in the status quo. YouTube and Twitter and other social media in which you can post art also proves this. The next argument is copyright. However, they don't challenge the fundamental property right laws which already exist, which means that these artists don't get access to this. As well as the fact that copyright costs tens of thousands of dollars, which is not accessible. Their youth engagement argument, I already answered this. Art classes and YouTube will solve this.